In one of his last interviews, George Harrison of the Beatles speaks about Paul McCartney's Raggedy Ann and Andy obsession in the late 70s. 1999.
Oh yeah, I remember that. Oh, it was creepy. It was very creepy. You know, you'd go over to Paul's house and there'd be all these dolls everywhere. These Raggedy Ann and Andy dolls that were so creepy. I mean, just one of them is creepy, but thousands of them. And I knew Paul had a problem, and we all did, you know. And of course, John and Paul weren't the best of friends at that time, but when I told John about it, you know, he didn't laugh or anything. He didn't think it was funny that Paul had this problem. He'd laughed at a lot of other Paul's pitfalls, like when Paul got that cucumber stuck up his ass and had to go to the hospital. John laughed. But he did not laugh at the Raggedy Ann and Andy collection, because that's creepy, you know. And Paul, well, you know, some of Paul's lyrics have been known to be creepy at times, and Paul can be creepy, but this was creepy even for Paul. Ringo Starr.
So I was talking the other day with George, and we were remembering, you know, this is something I don't like to bring up, but, you know, from about 1976 till about 1979, Paul was obsessed with this Raggedy Ann and Andy collection that he started collecting, and of course this is long before eBay, you know. We didn't even know where he was getting all of them. Of course he was Paul McCartney. You know, he had hundreds of millions of dollars. He could, you know, get whatever he wanted, so he got a lot of Raggedy Ann and Andy's, and he got the original ones from like the 1800s or something. And I went over his house one day in late 76 when he had just become obsessed with this, and looked all around, and he said, "Would you like a spot of tea?" I said, "Sure, Paul, but what's all this going on here?" He says, "What do you mean?" I looked around and pointed to it. I said, "On this shelf, on that shelf, on the floor, on the couch, on the Davenport, you know, on the Chesterfield. What is all of this?" He says, "It's me Raggedy Ann and Andy collection." I said, "Raggedy Ann and Andy, what are you talking about?" He said, "They're dolls." I said, "I know what they are, Paul. I'm not, you know, I'm not Amish. I know what they are." I said, "Why do you have thousands of them?" Because I could just see that there were thousands of them from various ages and times and history. And I said, Paul, this is what's going on with you, you know. And we sat down and had tea, and he tried to convince me the whole time that there was nothing wrong. There was nothing wrong, he says, you know, the way Paul talks in that sing-songy voice. "Oh, everything's fine, Ringo, you know, it's just a collection, it's just a collection." I said, "Paul, you know, people collect stamps and coins and ships in the bottle and all this stuff, but rock stars don't collect Raggedy Ann and Andy." And there was a silence for about a minute, you know. And in conversation, you know, if you're talking to somebody and there's a minute of silence, that's a long time. And then he asked me if I wanted more tea, and I knew he was just gone. He was just gone.
Paul McCartney, 1987.
Oh, well, you know, it's not that weird. You know, people collect things, various things. I mean, some people collect baseball caps. Some people collect basketballs. Some people collect stuffed elephants, you know. For me, it happened to be Raggedy Ann and Andy, and I'm over it. I've sold them all, you know. Most of them I'll donate to children's hospitals, but they told me they didn't want them. And I said, "Why don't you want them?" They said, "Because they're creepy, and the children cry when they see them." And I said, "Well, I didn't cry when I saw them. I smiled, you know. I would go into a certain room I had in my house with all the Raggedy Anns and Andys, and I would have a little music box that would play Edelweiss from The Sound of Music. And I would put on my little ballet slippers, and I would dress up as Raggedy Ann. You know, I didn't like dressing as Raggedy Andy because, I don't know, I just thought it was more proper to dress as Raggedy Ann. I don't know, because her name was first, you know, and I was always first in the Beatles, so I gotta be first. So, I would dress up as Raggedy Ann with the yarn for my hair, and I'd put the freckles on my face and the little sort of plaid dress, and I'd dance around to the music box. And, you know, one time George came over and saw me doing this. He thought it was absolutely weird. I said, "George, this is, you know, there's nothing weird about this."
George Harrison, 1989.
So I opened the door, and there he was, and I was just silent. I was absolutely silent for about, what do you think? You see your best friend there, he's there dressed up in girl's clothing, but not just a girl, but a doll, a Raggedy Ann. He was dressed, he had the wig. Where do you get a Raggedy Ann wig? He's a rock star, he's one of the Beatles. I just stood there in silence. I didn't say a word. I wanted him to notice me, so that he could see the genuine look of whatever my look was on my face. And I just stood there for about 5 minutes, and he's twirling, and he's doing all these pirouettes, and it was just creepy. And finally he opened, because he had his eyes closed the whole time. He was in ecstasy. He was in ecstasy. He was in bliss. And believe me, I'm not one to question a person's happiness, but this was creepy. So finally he opens his eyes. I guess his moment of epiphany had passed, and he sees me and he says, "Oh, George, what you doing?" As if none of this had been going on. As if I weren't standing there on the second floor of his house, looking at this creepy room full of Raggedy Ann and Andy dolls. And him, dressed as Raggedy Andy like some fucking serial killer, twirling around and doing spins and pirouettes and splits. I said, "Paul, this has gotten bad."
John Lennon, 1980.
Oh, well, this is the thing. One of the reasons I, don't talk to Paul anymore is because, I talked to George, and he said that he went over there and he saw Paul with all these dolls that he'd been collecting, these rag dolls or something that he was obsessed with, What is it, Yoko?
Raggedy Ann and Andy.
Oh, yes, Raggedy Ann and Andy, which is creepy. I never bought my children any Raggedy Ann and Andy paraphernalia, because it's just creepy. So for a rock star, for Paul to... I said I can't call him in this condition because it doesn't seem right. I must admit I've laughed at some of his past, tomfoolery. There's a time he had to go to the hospital for a rather embarrassing reason that I won't say on television. But I wasn't going to call him in this condition with all these bloody dolls all over the place. It didn't seem right.
Ringo Starr, 1995.
Oh, yeah. So, we haven't spoken of this too much because, Paul asked us not to, but, he admits it. He admits it was a weird period, but he won't admit the full scope of its weirdness. He won't admit that it was fucking sick, I heard the time that George apparently showed up and caught Paul in a Raggedy Ann garb, that he was dressed up. He was dressed up as Raggedy Ann. And he was dancing and twirling and doing pirouettes and ballet, and Paul doesn't know ballet. Paul doesn't know how to dance. Paul doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground when it comes to moving from one side of the room to another without tripping. But there he was, dressed up with the white stockings and the weird shoes, the Mary Janes, I think they're called. It's just creepy. I said, "George, you're putting me on. What you been smoking, mate? Can I have some?" He says, "No, I'm serious. This is what I saw Paul doing." I said, "George, come on. This is not the Paul. I know it's not the Paul. You're putting me on." He guaranteed me. And after about a half hour, I kept him on the phone. I tried to wear him down. He was serious. Because he had a key to Paul's house. We always had keys to each other's houses. That's the kind of relationship we had. And he showed up unannounced one day, just wanted to say hi to Paul. And Paul's in the room. Pirouettes and all, Raggedy Ann, the yarn hair and the freckles on the cheek. It must have been macabre. It must have been absolutely macabre.
Paul McCartney, 1998.
Oh, well, it was something I was into, and they weren't, So, when you're into something and other people aren't, they'll always look at you strangely. And they looked at me strangely because of my Raggedy Ann and Andy collection. I still to this day, I say, yeah, it was a little bit weird. But, people collect all sorts of things, records. And people collect cars, people collect tires, people collect old pieces of string. It's not that weird.
Raggedy Ann and Andy. People collect them. You know, because I was part of a network. I was part of the lower southeastern Tennessee Raggedy Ann and Andy Club, which was at that time the largest Raggedy Ann and Andy club in the world, and I was part of them. And we would trade dolls with each other. It wasn't that weird. Ringo Starr, 2005.
Oh, it was awful. And we don't bring it up anymore. We just don't bring it up because I don't want to hear him excuse it. The way he was behaving and cavorting around with the dolls and the thousands of them in the house. And I have to say, about 1981, when I went to his house and they were mostly gone, I was so relieved, but I went to the bathroom, you know, had to relieve myself. Of course, that's usually why you go to the bathroom. But anyway, I went and there was one of them sitting on the tank of the latrine. There was one Raggedy Andy doll sitting there, staring at me, just blankly. And I thought, oh, he's not completely cured. And to this day, whenever I see Paul, he's got that goddamn Raggedy Andy, that keychain on his, you know, the keychain. He's got the Raggedy Andy. I'm not kidding you. He's still got it. He still won't let it go. It's awful.